In the upheaval that has continued to unravel during my time away, I find myself reflecting on January of 2017 and how electric we all were during that time. It was the aftermath of the 2016 elections, and we found ourselves directly or indirectly navigating a river of rapid change. And one word that soars above all others to characterize that period of time for me is resistance. The sparks of resistance rained down upon our country from coast to coast and everywhere in between, and it was truly life-changing to see it happen in real time. So at that time, I was traveling across the country on a speaking tour called No Child Behind Bars, Collective Liberation from the U.S. to Palestine. Our focus was on youth detention and incarceration of Black and brown youth here in the U.S. and also of Palestinian youth in Palestine. Our talk linked systemic racism in the States, privatized prisons and profiteering, the school-to-prison pipeline, and how the apartheid in Palestine was not so different than the practices used here to subjugate Black and brown populations here in the U.S. Now, this tour was planned long before the 2016 election and the 2017 inauguration, and we could not have predicted the climate in which we would be traveling throughout the U.S. Beginning in early to mid-January 2017, we traveled to about 17 cities across the country in around 21 days. And each place we traveled to had become a site of resistance. Near the beginning of our tour, we were on the West Coast, speaking in Southern California, during which we ran into one of the larger sites of the first Women's March. We were in the airport in Chicago right after the airport bans and the subsequent protests that followed. We traveled to town halls of unassuming Midwestern towns that actually house large immigrant and Muslim populations, and they were gearing up to resist the Muslim bans. We even came through here through DC at that time. The whole country was activated with this spirit of resistance and rebellion. And in all those cities, and all those speaking engagements, and the constant news cycle that followed us with the reports of protests and demonstrations happening all around us, at that time I was reminded of sitting in this small, hot, cramped room in Palestine in 2015 with a group called Moxim Watch. Now, this group of elder Jewish women provided guard and protection for Palestinians at the border, at the military checkpoints, whether that be a watchful eye or help in getting support or care, or just to know that somebody is there with them. These women stood guard. So one of the people on our delegation with me, she was frustrated with a lack of adequate response to a question that she had asked. It was a political question, to which the elder woman had answered something that didn't quite meet her satisfaction. And so the woman in our delegation, she proclaimed, "So you just don't have hope?" So after 20 or more years of watching the military checkpoints, these elder women, they didn't quite have an answer to what the political solution should be, at least not one that they felt like sharing with us. They weren't there to share with us their analysis or their commentary. They were there to embody resistance and love right before our eyes. And for me, that was the answer to the question, that there is hope within that resistance. Much like the elder women within Moxim Watch, we're in a period with unending chaos which seems to be spiraling out of control before our very eyes. Our beloved narrative of onward and upward, it's been challenged in ways that feel irreparable. We're witnessing a callousness and cruelty that many of us can't reckon with, let alone understand. We find ourselves enmeshed in a struggle, not only for political improvement, which is important, but also for common decency, for empathy, for humanity. And I think it's safe to say that many of us are wondering the same thing that the woman in my delegation wondered, which is, where is the hope? In this political town, there's always a tendency to find hope within the political system, getting the right people, the right representatives, the right figures in place to carry our democracy forward. And while that's a very effective and critical method, we find that we are also called to something deeper, especially as people of faith. We're called not only to political process, but to a human process as well. We are called to one another. And in that sense, resistance becomes our greatest ally and our greatest source of hope, because there is joy in that resistance. Not because it's pretty or easy or straightforward, but because it's what we have to offer in this world to one another. In the words of Howard Thurman, what the world needs now is people who have come alive. And in those 21 days at the beginning of 2017, I witnessed an aliveness that moved mountains. And that same spirit is in the air still today. That spirit is moving among us, activating our hearts and our minds, because we are so incredibly needed in these times. Resistance is not only about what we get out and do in the streets or in the voting booths. It's not always drastic or all at once. Sometimes it's barely visible. And it's not only external, it's also about where we stretch ourselves as people woven together in that inescapable garment of destiny we've heard so much about. How we allow ourselves to change, how we allow ourselves to lean into discomfort. Resistance is learning. Resistance is letting go of perfection. Resistance is focus. Resistance is connection. It's a willingness to embrace messiness and unknown. It's an opportunity to grow together and create something much, much bigger than ourselves. Like the great Assata Shakur tells us, it is our duty to fight for our freedom, and it is our duty to win. We must love and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And when we resist isolation, when we resist rugged individualism, when we resist powerlessness, we break those chains. And in these times, we're called to break those chains for ourselves and also for one another, for the kids in cages, for the crisis happening at the border, for those who are victims of state violence time and time again, for those without clean water, for those without shelter, for the least of these, for each of us who live in this world that is bent on greed and profit. We reclaim our resistance by claiming one another. And embedded in that resistance are so many challenges for all of us, challenges for each of us, personal challenges to do our own internal work, whether that be the work of healing or forgiving or gathering our spirits or centering ourselves. Also challenges to the communities of which we are all a part, whether that be faith communities or family systems, relationships of any and all sorts. Examining what it means to care for each other, to get honest, what it means to be in conflict, what it means to get honest and be vulnerable and be effective and lasting in meaningful ways. And likewise, we face challenges in our institutions, and that is each and every institution. What are the ways that systemic oppression has persisted and shaped the institutions to which we belong? Who has traditionally had privilege and power? Who's at the table? Who is welcome? Who is included? These are questions we must ask of the institutions that we belong to. We're dealing with those questions in our very institution of the Unitarian Universalist Association all the time. And as messy and as complex and complicated as it may be, it is absolutely vital and critical to our survival, because it's all a part of this beautiful woven existence of resistance. Gathering ourselves, coming alive, protecting one another, losing our chains, resisting unjust policies and practices, resisting isolation, resisting separation. I reflect on 2017 rather than some distant time in our past, because we were all here for that. We all persisted. We all learned. We came alive once again all together, not for the first time and definitely not for the last. We've long left the shore of comfort and complacency. Gone are the good old days, if there ever really were such a thing for any of us. Because resistance isn't an object to possess or a task on a list that we get to check off. Much like spirit, it moves through each of us, calling to us in different ways, speaking to us in different languages. Much like the river, resistance is flowing, surrounding each of us, inviting us to let go of the shore and navigate, not as lone wolves, but as people, empowered and held by love. Much like those elder women in Moxham Watch, resistance stands by, watchful, waiting, preparing, accompanying, and most of all, ready and willing. And finally, resistance is joy, or rather, joy is resistance. Not always happiness, not always content, and definitely not complacent, but joy. Like the Hopi elder says, see who is in there with you and celebrate, because in these challenging and difficult times, I am glad that we are not alone. We have one another, even if we don't have solutions, even if we don't have answers, even if we will stumble through to figure out the right way to navigate all of this, we at least have one another. We do not have to do this alone. We are here and we are prepared and we are ready because we were literally made for these times. We wouldn't be here otherwise. What a blessing. What a joy to be in this situation, poised and ready with resources and with support to face what will surely come very soon. We're out of time, and we know this. This summer alone, the last 2 months alone have shown us how out of time we are. But we are ready because we're here, we're poised, we're watchful, and because we resist. As we prepare ourselves for the many, many ways that resistance will touch our hearts and our lives in these times to come very soon, may we know that we are held in abundance and joy, that we are one another's keeper, even if we don't always make each other happy, even if we can't always agree, even if we'd rather do things differently, we still belong to one another. May we know that we were made for these times. May we reach out a hand to those in need. May we find the spirit of love and resistance woven into our lives, sustaining us, preparing us, and holding us in the many ways that it does every single day of our lives. May it always be so. Ashe, and blessed be.